In 1871, deep within the rolling valleys of rural Kentucky, the whispers began. The land was isolated, a patchwork of farms separated by forests, streams, and the silence of distance. Most families lived simple lives of plowing and prayer, their days measured by the rhythm of the seasons. But in the southern bend of the valley, beyond a stretch of oak and cedar, there was a piece of land that the locals rarely spoke of. It belonged to a single family, distant, secretive, and said to be bound by rules that no outsider could ever understand. Their farm was a place where children were raised, where fields were tilled, and where the night seemed to fall heavier than anywhere else. And beneath that farm, hidden from sight, there were said to be graves, dozens of them without markers, without names. This is where our story begins. If you love dark, forgotten history, consider subscribing for more. And as you listen, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Because tonight, as we unravel the secrets of this valley, you might notice the shadows around you growing a little longer. The family had lived there for generations, or so the older farmers claimed. No one could quite remember when they first appeared. Some said the land was theirs since before the Civil War. Others believed they had moved in during the chaos of the war years, taking advantage of the confusion to settle without notice. Their surname, rarely spoken, carried little weight in the county records. What people remembered most was not their name, but their silence. They seldom came to town, and when they did, they kept their eyes lowered, their voices soft. Women in shawls, children clustered together, men who seemed to speak only among themselves. The whispers began small stories traded over whiskey bottles at the general store, or muttered among women at Sunday gatherings. Strange people, that lot, one neighbor would say. Never sell their crops, only keep to themselves. Another might lower her voice. Glancing at the church door, have you seen the children too pale, too quiet, and they all look the same? For most, it was enough to shrug and go on with their lives. The valley was large, and every family carried its secrets. But there was something different about this one, something that clung to their name like a shadow. The way their fields never seemed empty, even in winter, with figures moving under lantern light. The way their livestock disappeared without ever being traded or butchered in town. The way the children grew, yet never seemed to leave the farm. In the evenings, when the sun dropped behind the trees and the mist rose from the fields, the family's land looked almost like another world. Their farmhouse large, weathered, and built from thick timbers sat at the edge of a dark woods. Smoke curled from its chimney, but no laughter or music ever drifted from its walls. Travelers passing through said they felt watched, even in daylight, their horses uneasy on the dirt road that ran near the property. One story told of a peddler, a man who sold trinkets and tools door to door, who claimed he had once stepped onto their porch. He was greeted not with words, but with silence, a half-circle of children staring at him, their faces nearly identical, their eyes a pale gray, like mirrors lined up in a row. He said later. The man left without selling a single thing, and when he tried to recall the visit afterward, he found he could not remember how many children there were, only that they looked at him all at once, unblinking. These tales spread quietly, like roots under soil, twisting and tangling with each retelling. Some neighbors believed the family practiced strange rites, remnants of old beliefs carried from distant lands. Others whispered of sickness, of children born too close in blood. But there was also fear, the kind that made people lower their voices, the kind that warned them not to pry too deeply. The valley needed peace. The land was wide enough for silence. Still, questions lingered. Why did so many travelers vanish near the southern bend? Why did farmhands hired from nearby counties never return to town once they worked that land? And why, late at night, did some villagers swear they heard faint cries carried on the wind? As if from beneath the earth itself, the whispers grew louder after the war ended. When census takers began their rounds in the 1870s, when they came to the farm, they recorded fewer names than expected. Children were seen, moving in the yard, yet not all of them appeared in the official counts. A neighbor who accompanied one official swore later that the man who met them at the door seemed nervous, his hands stained with soil though it was not planting season. Behind him, in the dim hallway, stood a girl with hair hanging over her face. She stared at them without speaking, and when the door shut, the neighbor said it felt like a coffin closing. By then, the rumor of graves had begun. A hunter claimed he stumbled upon a patch of turned soil near the family's cornfield, where no crops grew. He swore he saw small bones rising from the dirt, like roots that had been pushed upward. Others dismissed him, saying it was the skeleton of a deer. Yet no one went to look. The sheriff, when asked, said simply, "Best leave them alone." Some families don't take kindly to questions. And so the whispers continued. Not accusations, not yet. Only the uneasy murmur of neighbors who knew something was wrong, but lacked the courage or perhaps the will to confront it. In the valley, life was hard enough. Better to keep one's head down, one's prayers steady, and let the shadows lie where they were. What no one could guess, at least not yet, was just how deep those shadows would run. Beneath that soil, beneath the fields that looked so ordinary from a distance, lay a secret that would stain the valley for generations. 73 unmarked graves. 73 bodies without names, without markers, their stories lost to silence, and the family who lived above them still there, still watching, as the whispers grew. The farmhouse stood alone, its silhouette pressed against the edge of a dense stretch of woods. Travelers passing by often described it as more fortress than home, its timbers darkened by age and weather, its roof slanting low like a creature crouching against the wind. The house seemed to sag toward the trees, as if the forest itself was slowly reclaiming it. No laughter spilled from its windows, no music from its porch, only the smell of smoke from the chimney and the uneasy sense that someone inside was always watching. For the family who lived there, the house was more than shelter. It was their world, their cage, and their sanctuary. Generations had been born and buried within its walls, and for those who ventured close enough, it was said that the very boards of the floor groaned as if weighted down by memories. Outsiders rarely entered, and when they did, they never lingered long. Locals spoke of the strange silence that clung to the property. Children were sometimes seen playing in the yard, their movements quick and furtive, but their voices never carried. No shouts, no arguments, not even the joyful cries of youth. Just stillness. It was as though the air itself had been instructed to hush. Visitors who walked past at dusk swore they heard faint whispers through the walls, like chanting or prayers in a language they did not recognize. The windows were another subject of rumor. Most were covered with heavy curtains, drawn even in summer when the valley air grew hot and stifling. At night, a lantern might glow behind the fabric, casting strange shapes against the cloth, elongated figures that seemed too tall, or too many heads gathered close. Once, a group of boys dared each other to creep to the yard. They returned, pale and shaken, claiming that a face had stared down at them from an upstairs window, pale and expressionless, its eyes reflecting the moonlight as though they were made of glass. Despite its foreboding presence, the house was not neglected. The fields were tended, the livestock fed, the fences mended. But the family's refusal to trade openly in town raised questions. Where did their supplies come from? How did they feed so many mouths without buying or selling like everyone else? On rare occasions, a wagon would appear in the distance, rolling toward the house with its cargo covered by canvas. By morning it would be gone, and no one in the valley could say what it had carried or who had driven it. Inside, the house was said to be divided into strange, uneven rooms. A traveling preacher, one of the few outsiders ever admitted inside, recalled later that the rooms were too narrow, the ceilings too low. He claimed the stairways bent at odd angles, and that the house seemed to have been built in pieces, added on across the years like patchwork. Some rooms smelled of damp earth, others of medicine. The preacher swore he heard a child crying from somewhere deep within, yet when he asked, the family led him quickly to the door. He left shaken, refusing ever to return. The neighbors wondered why the family built so close to the woods. Most farms cleared wide fields, open spaces for crops and livestock. But this house pressed against the trees, as though hiding. The forest loomed over the roof, thick and dark, and those who hunted near its borders sometimes caught sight of figures moving between the trunks. Not deer, not men either, one hunter said. Something else. But when pressed, he refused to explain. The house itself seemed to breathe at night. From the road, people described hearing creaks and groans. As though the timbers were shifting under a weight, some said it was the wind. Others swore they saw lights moving through the trees, lanterns carried by unseen hands, weaving toward the back of the property. Always the movement led toward the same place, a narrow clearing behind the house where the ground was uneven, mounded in ways that resembled graves. Children in the valley grew up fearing the house. Parents told them stories to keep them away, tales of curses, of sickness that clung to anyone who stepped across the threshold. Yet fear was not always enough. Curiosity drew the bravest or the most foolish closer. One boy who tried to steal apples from the orchard near the woods claimed that when he reached for the fruit, a pale hand shot out from behind the tree, snatching the apple before he could. He swore the hand belonged to a child no taller than his shoulder, with long, bony fingers and a face too similar to the others he had glimpsed. As the seasons passed, the family remained fixed within their walls. Storms battered the valley, floods swept the fields, drought cracked the soil, yet the house stood unchanged. It seemed untouched by time, immune to the hardships that plagued other farms. And that, perhaps, was what frightened people most. Families came and went, fortunes rose and fell, but that house remained constant, like a monument to secrets no one dared unearth. There was a saying among the locals, "You can hear the woods before you see them, but you can feel that house before you hear it." Travelers learned to quicken their pace on the road near the property, urging their horses forward until the trees swallowed the silhouette behind them. What those travelers never knew, and what the neighbors only suspected, was that the true heart of the family's story beat not in the open fields or in the town they avoided, but within those walls at the edge of the woods. Behind its locked doors and shuttered windows, generations had been born, lived, and died without ever leaving, and whatever was happening inside was not meant for the outside world to see. The house remained, a silent sentinel at the border of forest and field, its secrets sealed in timber and stone, and as the valley slept, it seemed to wait patient, watchful, guarding something hidden deep in its rooms, or perhaps beneath its floors. Something that, if revealed, might explain why so many whispers circled in the valley, and why those whispers always returned to one place, the house at the edge of the woods, in rural Kentucky, where families were known by their roots as much as by their crops. Bloodlines were a matter of pride. Marriages linked farms. Names carried weight, and every generation sought to improve its lot by extending kinship beyond its fences. But the family at the edge of the woods was different. Their bloodline, the whispers claimed, did not spread outward. It folded in on itself. Neighbors had noticed it for years, the way siblings seemed to marry later than most, or never leave the farm at all. The children, who appeared, generation after generation, bore uncanny resemblances to one another. Not merely familial likeness, but eerie sameness, pale eyes, narrow faces, dark hair that seemed to fall in the same pattern. Some older farmers muttered that it was as though the land itself had pressed them into molds, repeating the same faces across decades. It was not uncommon for rural communities to guard their own, especially in isolated valleys. But this family guarded theirs with a fierceness that went beyond custom. They allowed no outside suitors, no marriages to neighboring farms. When boys came calling in the spring dances, the daughters never appeared. When town gatherings brought young men and women together, the sons never showed. It was as if the family had drawn an invisible line across the dirt road, warning the outside world to stay away. The stories that grew from this silence were inevitable. Some said they followed an old faith, one that demanded purity of blood. Others suggested shame that deformities or sickness haunted them, and secrecy was the only shield against pity. But the darkest whispers were of incest, of unions forbidden by law and scripture, carried out in the name of keeping the land and its secrets bound to one lineage. One tale came from a midwife, years after she had left the valley. She spoke of being summoned in the dead of night to the farmhouse. There, under the glow of a single lantern, she delivered a child whose mother was scarcely older than 16. The men of the house stood watchful, silent in the doorway, their eyes fixed not on the mother but on the newborn, as if the infant itself was the only thing that mattered. The midwife claimed that when she asked who the father was, none answered. They simply turned their faces away. She left before dawn, clutching her payment, and swore never to return. Later, she told neighbors that she had seen another woman in the corner of the room, rocking an infant who looked exactly like the one she had just delivered. Though it could not have been older than a year, like a reflection, she said, as though the child had been born twice. Records of the family were scarce, but the census revealed troubling patterns. Names repeated sons given their fathers' names, daughters their mothers. Generations blurred together. It was nearly impossible to tell who belonged to which branch, because every branch twisted back into the same root. And while other farms celebrated marriages with the church bells and gatherings, the woods at the edge of their property remained silent. No witnesses, no celebrations, no vows heard beyond their walls. Some villagers told themselves it was mere stubbornness that the family clung to its privacy, nothing more, but others could not ignore the small signs. Children with stunted growth, their limbs too thin for their frames. Infants who lived only days, their graves hidden behind the orchard. And still others who grew but seemed strange, staring too long, speaking too late, walking in ways that unsettled the eye. It was said that the family viewed these children not as tragedy, but as proof that their blood remained their own, untouched by outsiders. In church sermons, the preacher warned against the sins of pride, of man trying to become his own God. Though he never named the family outright, all knew whom he meant. Yet no one confronted them, for fear and caution ran deeper than moral outrage. As the years passed, the signs of isolation grew sharper. The children's faces blurred into one another, so much so that visitors swore they could not tell siblings apart. One merchant who ventured close described them as copies from the same plate, their expressions blank, their eyes devoid of childhood spark. He returned to town unsettled, declaring that he would rather travel miles out of his way than pass their road again. The idea of an unbroken bloodline haunted the valley. It raised questions about what lay beneath the surface of the farm. What did such unions create behind closed doors? How many children had been buried before their first year? And what rituals might the family have devised to justify what the outside world would call abomination one autumn? A rumor spread that a boy from the farm had wandered into the woods and collapsed in a hunter's path. When the hunter carried him back toward the house, he claimed the boy whispered something strange before fainting. Father and uncle are the same. The hunter never returned to the property again, and he left the valley within the year. His tale, however, lingered, feeding the whispers that already coiled like smoke through the community. By the 1870s, the valley lived in uneasy acceptance. The family's land was their own, and no one dared interfere. But as more children appeared, faces repeating like ghosts of the past, the fear deepened. Neighbors began to wonder if the family sought not merely to preserve their blood, but to erase time itself, binding every generation into one endless circle. A bloodline unbroken and perhaps unholy. And behind that unbroken chain, beneath the soil of their farm, the graves were waiting silent markers of how high the cost of purity had been. In small rural towns, children were the measure of time. One could watch them grow, season after season, each new step marking the passage of years, the first awkward stride across a dirt floor, the first laugh ringing out over fields, the first Sunday in stiff church clothes. In the valley, most children bore the mix of their mother's and father's features, slight differences that carried the stories of ancestry. But when it came to the family at the edge of the woods, things were different. The children who emerged from that house looked disturbingly alike, so alike that outsiders whispered of unnatural repetition. At first glance, their similarity might have been dismissed as common kinship. But the more people saw them, the less natural it seemed. They were pale in skin and eye, their faces narrow, their expressions unnervingly calm. Their hair, dark and heavy, fell the same way across their brows. What unsettled neighbors most was that they seemed to age as mirror images of one another, each child appearing as though molded from the same face, slightly adjusted only by height. Stories of these strange children multiplied. A schoolteacher who once tried to gather them into lessons returned to town after a single week. She claimed the children sat in silence, barely responding, their gazes fixed on her with the same blank intensity. She swore that when she turned her back to write on the board, she heard them whispering not in playful chatter, but in low, rhythmic tones, as though repeating words together. When she demanded to know what they were saying, none answered, but when she glanced at their faces, she thought they were smiling, faint and identical. In the valley, parents began to forbid their children from playing near the farm. Yet curiosity lingered. Now and then, a village child would glimpse the others at the edge of the woods. They never spoke, never beckoned, only stood watching. One boy recounted that he threw a stone across the fence to draw their attention. All at once, the children's heads turned in perfect unison, their eyes fixed on him as though tied by a single string. He ran home crying, refusing ever to walk that path again. Some suspected that sickness was to blame. Inbreeding, they whispered, had robbed the children of variation, reducing their features into a single repeated mask. Yet others believed something darker, that these children were not born in the ordinary way. Perhaps they were the result of rituals whispered about in secret, rituals that bound flesh to flesh until the offspring resembled copies rather than individuals. A traveler passing through the valley left behind one of the most unsettling accounts. He claimed he saw a group of children near the farmhouse at dusk, playing a game in the yard. They formed a circle, their hands clasped, but their movements were not the skipping and laughter of play. Instead, they turned in slow rhythm, their eyes lifted toward the woods. He swore he counted 12 children, each face a reflection of the others. Like I had stumbled into a hall of mirrors, he wrote later, except every reflection could breathe. Even in church, their presence drew unease. On rare Sundays when the family brought them to service, the congregation stiffened. The children sat together, filling an entire pew, silent and still. Their mouths moved faintly when hymns were sung, but no voices rose. One witness claimed their lips moved not to the hymn but to some other rhythm, soundless yet synchronized. Afterward, when families greeted one another on the church lawn, the children did not mingle. They gathered in a tight cluster, their gray eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for something. What disturbed the community most was the sense that the children were not merely similar in face, but somehow bound in mind. When one moved, the other shifted. When one tilted a head, several mirrored the gesture. It was as though individuality had been drained, leaving behind a collective presence that unsettled anyone who watched for too long. Neighbors asked themselves unsettling questions. Were these children taught to behave this way, or was it something deeper, born into them? And if they were born of the same blood, how many generations had passed before this sameness became so complete? One chilling rumor claimed that the children were interchangeable. A merchant swore he once sold goods to the family and saw a young boy carry the items inside. Weeks later, he returned, and the same boy greeted him at the door, identical in face and size, though the merchant was sure months had passed. It was as if time had stood still, he muttered, unsettled, or as if another had taken his place, wearing the same body. The valley folk began to call them the children of the same face. The name stuck, whispered with unease. It became more than a description. It became a warning. Mothers told their own children to avoid eye contact if they ever crossed paths. Fathers quickened their steps past the property line. And the sheriff himself, when asked about the family's children, only shook his head and said, "Some things ain't ours to fix." Yet the image of those faces lingered, haunting the valley's collective memory. It was as if each child carried the weight of every one before them, repeating across time like a curse. Behind their silence, behind their sameness, lay a question no one dared voice aloud. What happens when a family refuses to let the bloodline break the children? It seemed, were the answer. Living reflections of a past that refused to fade, standing side by side in the shadow of a farmhouse where their parents and their parents before them had drawn the world inward, trapping it within their own veins. In every rural valley of Kentucky, doctors were rare. Most families relied on home remedies, midwives or the wisdom of elders. A physician, when one could be found, traveled wide distances, carrying his satchel of tinctures and tools to isolated farms. Yet, in this particular valley, the story was told of a doctor who had come long ago and who, for reasons no one could explain, never left. Some said he had first arrived during the war, a surgeon seeking refuge from the horrors he had seen in battlefield tents. Others believed he had come even earlier. A wandering physician whose knowledge exceeded the crude practices of rural medicine. Whatever his origins, the doctor became bound to the family at the edge of the woods, moving into their farmhouse and vanishing from the wider community. From that time on, the family never again sought outside medical help. Every illness, every birth, every death was handled within those walls. Neighbors recalled glimpses of him on rare occasions. He was a thin, stooped man with spectacles that glinted in the lantern light. His coat was always buttoned too high, and his gloves were never removed. Even in the heat of summer, children whispered that his face seemed stretched, pale and tight, as though he had shed too much of the world beyond the farmhouse. They called him the doctor who never left. His presence raised questions. Why would a man of science isolate himself so completely, giving up the comfort of towns and the companionship of colleagues? What had the family offered him that bound him so tightly some said it was wealth that they paid him in hidden fortunes? others suggested darker motives, that he had seen something on the farm that chained him there, whether by fascination or by fear. There were whispers. 2 of his practices. Hunters swore they had glimpsed him in the fields at night, lanterns swinging, with small shapes carried across his arms. More than one villager claimed to have seen him digging, his spade striking earth where no crops grew. The earth was mounded afterward, but no marker followed, and in the mornings, smoke poured from the farmhouse chimney, thick and acrid, as if something stronger than wood was burning. The midwife who once entered the house said she saw instruments that no farmer's family should possess: bone saws, glass jars, surgical tools polished with care. In one corner, she swore. A wooden table stood stained dark, its surface scored with lines as though blades had worked upon it too many times. And the doctor moved about this room with quiet efficiency, never speaking, his gloved hands quick and practiced. The children bore the signs of his presence as well. Some appeared stitched, faint scars traced along their scalps or behind their ears. Others walked stiffly, as though bones had been set and reset again. One merchant reported that when he visited, a child reached for a basket of flour and the sleeve slipped back, revealing a forearm crosshatched with lines that looked more surgical than accidental. The merchant left quickly, too unsettled to ask questions. But perhaps the most chilling tale came from a farmhand who had once worked the outer fields of the property. He claimed that, late one night, while moving hay near the barn, he saw a lantern glow through the slats. Peering inside, he watched the doctor bent over a figure stretched on a table. The figure was small, perhaps a child, and though its chest rose and fell faintly, the doctor cut into it with the precise movements. The farmhand swore he heard no cry, only a low hum from the doctor himself, as though he were soothing the subject or himself. Terrified, the farmhand fled, abandoning his pay and never returning to the valley. From then on, locals said the doctor had ceased to be a man of medicine and had become something else entirely. Perhaps he had turned the family into subjects of study, or perhaps he believed he was preserving them, stitching broken bloodlines into something whole. Whatever the truth, he remained unseen outside the farm, his name erased from records. His existence became legend, a figure known only by stories and glimpses, a presence as permanent as the family themselves. Decades later, the valley still repeated the same phrase when the farmhouse was mentioned. The doctor never left. And indeed, it seemed he hadn't. When men finally dared to cross into the property in later years, they found fragments of surgical instruments buried near the orchard. A rusted scalpel, glass bottles clouded with residue, and a set of wire spectacles, cracked but intact, lying in the soil as though waiting to be claimed. What became of the man himself, no one could say. Some believed he was buried among the unmarked graves, his body hidden as neatly as those he may have cut apart. Others swore he lived on, aging unnaturally, tending to the family in silence, and a few whispered that he had never been a man at all, but something the family had invited. A shadow in a doctor's shape, bound forever to their blood. The truth, as always in the valley, remained buried, but the image of the doctor lingered: the lantern light, the gloved hands, the quiet hum of a man working at night while the rest of the world slept. And above him, in the farmhouse rooms, the children of the same face dreamed in silence, their bodies marked by the touch of the physician who had never left. The valley had always been a place where strangers passed through. Merchants with wagons full of goods, farmhands drifting in search of work, even families traveling westward in search of land. The road that curved near the farmhouse at the edge of the woods was one of the few routes that cut through the rolling hills. But as the years wore on, people began to notice a pattern: too many travelers entered the valley, and too few ever left. The first disappearances were dismissed as bad luck. A peddler gone missing, a farmhand who simply wandered on, a child who strayed too far into the woods. In rural Kentucky, such losses were not uncommon. But then came the stories, the kind that made neighbors lower their voices and lock their doors earlier than usual. Stories that always seemed to circle back to the same stretch of road, the same shadowed property, the same silent family. One tale told of a drifter who had asked for work, seen walking toward the farmhouse one late autumn evening. He never returned to town, and no one recalled seeing him again. His name faded, but the memory of his tall frame and wide-brimmed hat lingered in gossip. He went to the farm, the townsfolk said, and the farm kept him. Another story came from a group of travelers who swore they heard cries in the night while camping near the property. Faint at first, then sharper pleas for help carried on the wind. They packed up before dawn, leaving the valley without finishing their journey. When questioned later, they claimed they had seen lanterns moving across the fields, but the figures carrying them were too many, their faces indistinct. It was like a procession, one traveler whispered, not searching for someone, but burying them. Farmhands, too, seemed to vanish into the soil of that place. In the lean years after the war, young men often offered their labor in exchange for food and shelter. Some were last seen walking down the dirt road toward the family's fields. Their belongings, left behind in town lodgings, were never claimed. At first, neighbors convinced themselves the boys had moved on, chasing better work further west, but the pattern became too sharp to ignore. Even locals were not spared. One neighbor, a man named Harlan, went missing after he quarreled with the family over a boundary line. He had accused them of moving the fence deeper into his pasture. Days later, his horse was found grazing near the woods, saddle intact, but Harlan himself had disappeared. His wife insisted he would never have abandoned his land. Yet no search was mounted, and the sheriff offered no explanation. "A man has a right to go his own way," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed unease. The silence of officials only deepened suspicion. Some believed the sheriff feared the family, others that he had been quietly warned to leave them alone. Either way, the vanishings continued. A merchant's ledger showed one final delivery of grain to the farmhouse, but the merchant himself never returned. His wagon was later found abandoned, its wheels sunk in the mud near a creek. No trace of him remained. In whispered gatherings, people began to connect the disappearances with the graves rumored to lie beneath the farm's soil. 73 unmarked mounds, hidden behind orchards and along the tree line. Could they all belong to the family alone, or had strangers, too, been swallowed by the earth, their bones mingling with those born of the bloodline? Theories flourished. Some said the family sacrificed outsiders, feeding their land with foreign blood to strengthen their own. Others claimed the doctor performed experiments, using travelers as subjects when his own kin were too few. Still, others believed it was simpler than that the family killed those who came too close, burying them quietly to protect their secrets. But the most unsettling theory came from a preacher who once visited the valley. He told his congregation elsewhere that the disappearances were no accident. They were chosen, he said. The family needed them, needed the new blood, but not for saving, for shaping. When pressed, he refused to explain further, only muttering, "Pray you never see their children up close." The fear grew so strong that by the late 1870s, travelers began to avoid the valley altogether. Word spread along the routes, "Don't take the road near the farm." Merchants planned longer journeys to skirt the land, and farmhands looked for work elsewhere. The valley became more isolated than ever, the family left alone with their secrets and their graves. Still, from time to time, someone vanished. A child sent on an errand never returned. A rider passing through never reached the next town. Each disappearance added weight to the legend, like stones piling one upon another. And always the question lingered, where had they gone? The answer, whispered but never spoken aloud, was simple. They had gone into the earth, into the farm, into the silence that had always waited at the edge of the woods. The valley folk lived with their fear, burying it as surely as the family buried its dead. Yet, in the stillness of the night, when the wind rustled the trees and the owls called, some swore they could hear faint sounds from the farm, muffled cries, hurried footsteps, the clang of a spade striking earth. And with each sound the valley remembered. The farm took what it wished. The farm kept what it took. And no one ever asked too many questions. The land itself began to betray the family. For years, their secrets had remained hidden beneath the soil. But the earth does not keep silence forever. In the far fields and near the line of trees, odd mounds rose from the ground, small at first, then larger, as if the dirt itself could no longer conceal what was buried there. Farmers working nearby spoke of patches where crops refused to grow, where the soil smelled faintly of iron when turned with a plow. Some said they found bones of animals, others were not so sure. The whispers of graves had long existed, but by the 1880s, too many had seen with their own eyes. One hunter described stumbling upon a clearing behind the orchard, where the ground looked freshly disturbed. He swore he saw the curve of a skull half buried, pale as the moonlight, before he turned and fled. Another claimed that his dog unearthed something small, wrapped in cloth, that he hastily reburied with trembling hands. Neither man spoke of it publicly, but the stories crept into town like smoke through cracks. The family never acknowledged the graves. When questioned, they offered silence or turned their gaze away. Yet neighbors noticed that, late at night, lanterns moved across the fields, carried by figures who dug with spades. Always the same quiet ritual: earth lifted, shapes lowered, earth pressed flat again. No markers, no words of mourning, just mounds left to blend with the land. Children dared each other to count them from the road. 73. One boy whispered after sneaking close, though how he could know so precisely remained a mystery. The number stuck, passed from mouth to mouth until it became part of the valley's legend: 73 unmarked graves beneath the farm. Some said they belonged to the family's own dead infants who lived too briefly. Children malformed by bloodlines too close. Others believed they held strangers, the missing travelers and farmhands, their lives consumed to protect the family's secret. Perhaps both were true. The preacher, careful not to name names, spoke from the pulpit of Cain's curse, of blood crying out from the ground. The earth knows what is hidden beneath it, he warned, and the Lord will not be mocked. His words carried weight, but no one acted. The sheriff looked the other way. Families busied themselves with their own burdens, and fear remained the strongest law of all. On stormy nights, when rain lashed the valley and lightning struck the fields, some claimed they saw the mounds rise higher, as though the dead beneath shifted, pressing upward. One farmer swore that after a flood, the current of a swollen creek carried bones downstream, small, white, unmistakably human. He told no one but his wife, and she made him swear never to repeat it, fearing what might follow. By now, the land itself was shunned. Neighbors refused to hunt near the woods. Their livestock wandered far from the fence lines. Horses balked when led past the orchard, snorting and rolling their eyes until they were whipped onward. Animals know, people muttered, what men pretend not to see. The most haunting account came from a group of children who, on a dare, crept toward the fields at dusk. They claimed they heard faint cries, as if voices seeped from beneath the dirt. Not words, but long, muffled moans rising with the mist. They ran, screaming, back to town, and though their parents scolded them, none doubted the terror in their eyes. Yet, for all the stories, no one ever dared dig. To disturb those graves would mean confronting what the valley had chosen to ignore. And so the mounds remained, silent witnesses to decades of secrecy. The family continued their rituals, their line unbroken, their house looming at the edge of the woods. And beneath them, the earth held its dead unnamed, uncounted, unblessed. Some believed the graves cursed the valley itself. Crops failed more often near the farm. Storms struck harder, sickness lingered longer. Others claimed that those who gazed too long at the mounds found themselves haunted in dreams, faces pale and identical, eyes staring from beneath the soil. The number 73 echoed in their sleep, a tally of the forgotten. By the time outsiders passed through again, the legend was already fixed. That farm, the locals said, is built on graves. Travelers who asked further received only silence, or the same warning repeated like scripture: do not linger on that land. But the land lingered on them. Every unmarked grave a question, every mound a story untold. And as the years passed, the number never changed. Always 73. No more. No less, as though the family themselves kept count, ensuring the balance of their secret remained unbroken. The farm continued its quiet existence, its fences mended, its fields tended, its house crouched in shadow, and the valley lived with the knowledge that under that soil lay the evidence of something unspeakable. The question was no longer whether the graves existed. The question was who or what filled them. The legend of the farm might have remained a whisper, a quiet unease buried with the graves. Had it not been for one night, it was autumn, the air heavy with the smell of damp leaves, when the valley saw something they would never forget. They called it the Night of the Lanterns. The evening began as ordinary as any other. Families gathered around hearths, oil lamps flickered in windows, and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke across the hills. But sometime after midnight, dogs began to bark. First one, then many, their howls echoing through the valley. Farmers stepped out of their homes to calm them, only to notice an eerie glow on the horizon. Lanterns, dozens of them, were moving across the fields of the forbidden farm. Not one or two, as had been seen in the past, but a procession. The lights weaved through the darkness, bobbing like fireflies, illuminating the shapes of figures who carried them. From the distance, it was impossible to tell how many there were, but the movement suggested more than the family alone. Too many. Those who watched from the safety of their porches swore they heard sounds riding the wind, faint cries, a woman's wail, the sharp rhythm of shovels striking soil. Some claimed they saw shadows stretched across the fields, bodies carried between them, limp and heavy. The glow of the lanterns reflected off pale faces, though no one could say whether those faces were alive or dead. The spectacle lasted for hours. Some said the lanterns gathered near the orchard, where the ground was already thick with unmarked mounds. Others believed they saw them moving deeper into the woods, as though expanding the hidden burial ground. And through it all, the farmhouse loomed, its windows dark, as if the true heart of the night's work lay outside, under the open sky. One farmer, braver or perhaps more reckless than the rest, took his son and crept to a ridge overlooking the fields. From there, he swore he saw a scene that haunted him until his death. Figures in long coats dug furiously, the lantern light flickering across their strained faces. Beside them lay shallow pits, and within those pits, shapes, small, wrapped in cloth, their outlines unmistakably human. The farmer's son, pale with fear, tugged at his father's sleeve until at last they fled. Years later, the boy, by then an old man, still refused to speak of what else they had seen. As dawn approached, the lanterns faded one by one. By sunrise, the valley was silent again. but the ground near the orchard seemed different. Fresh earth piled high, dark and damp. Horses refused to pass, turning stubbornly aside. Even the birds avoided the trees. The story of that night spread quickly. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, the product of fearful imaginations. But too many had seen the glow. Too many had heard the dogs. Too many had counted the lanterns moving like a funeral procession across the land. What had been whispered now became something else, a certainty, etched into the valley's memory. Speculation ran wild. Had the family been burying their own dead? A plague that swept silently through their bloodline? Had they taken other strangers, neighbors, and hidden them beneath the earth? Or was it something darker, some ritual performed under the cover of night, binding their lineage to forces unseen? The sheriff refused to comment, saying only that what a family did on its own land was no business of his. But the preacher's voice grew louder in sermons, thundering of sins hidden in darkness, of graves that cried out for justice. Yet even he never dared step foot on the farm. For the valley folk, the night of the lanterns became a turning point. Where once they had whispered, now they avoided the subject entirely. Fear shifted from curiosity to dread. Parents forbade their children even to glance at the farmhouse. Travelers who asked for directions were warned away from the southern road. The farm itself seemed to retreat deeper into shadow, its presence heavier, as though the weight of 73 graves or more pulled it down into the soil. Still, some nights the glow returned. Not as many lanterns, not as bright, but enough for those who watched from their porches to feel the old fear rise again. The land seemed restless, unable to hold its dead, and each time, the people of the valley wondered if one day the graves would no longer remain silent, if what was buried there would find a way to rise. No one ever spoke openly of the night of the lanterns again, but every family kept the memory, passing it down quietly to their children. A warning disguised as legend. "Stay away from the farm," they said. "Stay away, or you'll join the lanterns in the field." The valley slept uneasily after that, and though the farmhouse remained unchanged, the air around it carried a heaviness that no sunlight could lift. What had truly happened that night was never recorded, never proven. But in the silence that followed, the land itself seemed to whisper, reminding all who lived nearby that the dead do not always stay buried. In the days that followed the night of the lanterns, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The barking dogs grew silent. The church bells rang more softly, and even the wind through the trees carried an unnatural hush. It was as if the land itself recoiled from what it had witnessed. The farmhouse at the edge of the woods stood as it always had, timbers dark. Curtains drawn, but something about it felt altered. The smoke from its chimney was thinner, slower to rise, and those who dared to pass along the road claimed the fields were strangely empty. The family, once glimpsed moving about their chores, appeared fewer in number, where once a line of children might be seen tending to livestock or carrying baskets to the porch. Now only 2 or 3 figures emerged, their pale faces downturned. Women who had occasionally ventured into town no longer came. The silence extended not only across the farm, but into the community itself. No one spoke of what they had seen, yet everyone knew. The preacher's sermons grew heavy with warnings of judgment, though he avoided naming names. He spoke of Sodom, of graves that swallowed the guilty, of blood that stained the earth. His congregation listened stiffly, their eyes flicking toward the empty pew where the family had once sat in clustered silence. After that night, they never returned to church again. Neighbors began to notice other changes. Lanterns no longer flickered across the fields, but the ground near the orchard bore new scars, ridges of earth that had not been there before. Crops refused to take root in those spots, and weeds sprouted thick and wild. Some swore they saw small depressions in the soil, as though something pressed upward from beneath, but no one dared step closer. What frightened the valley most was not what was seen, but what was missing. The usual sounds of farm life, the bray of mules, the clatter of tools, the shouts of children were gone. Days passed in utter quiet. Travelers noted the farmhouse seemed abandoned, yet a curtain might twitch if watched too long, or a faint shadow shift across the yard. The family was still there. Hidden, reduced, but clinging to their land like roots that refused to be pulled. Rumors spread of sickness. Perhaps, people reasoned, the family had been struck by plague, and the night of the lanterns was their desperate burial of the fallen. Others believed madness had consumed them, driving them deeper into isolation. A few whispered that they had turned upon themselves, culling their own numbers in some ritual of blood. Whatever the truth, the silence afterward was worse than the activity before. Children dared each other to creep near the fence line, reporting back that the animals were gone. Barns stood empty, and the orchard smelled of rot. One boy swore he saw a figure at the upstairs window, a child's face pale and expressionless, staring down with eyes that did not blink. Yet, when he pointed, his companions saw nothing. The sheriff avoided questions. When asked directly if he would investigate, he shook his head and said only, "There's nothing there for you to know." His refusal became another layer of dread, for if the law would not act, then whatever secret lay beneath that soil was beyond mortal reckoning. The community, once only wary, became fearful to the point of superstition. Mothers warned their children not to speak the family's name aloud. Men crossed themselves when they passed the southern road, and when storms gathered, people swore the thunder lingered longer above that farm, as if the heavens themselves were reluctant to leave. The years blurred. The silence became a fixture, an unspoken boundary that divided the valley. Life went on elsewhere: marriages, births, harvests, but at the farm, time seemed to stop. No new faces appeared. No weddings joined them to other families. No voices joined the hymns of the church. The bloodline folded deeper into itself, sealed away behind walls that few dared approach. Some wondered if the family sought to erase themselves, burying not only their dead, but their presence in the world. Others argued the opposite, that they were not gone at all, but waiting, watching, rebuilding whatever ritual had been interrupted. But the silence gave no answers, only unease. By the late 19th century, the farm had become a ghost within the living valley. Its fences leaned, its fields grew wild, but the house remained standing, its windows dark. Strangers traveling through felt its weight even without knowing the stories. Horses balked, children wept, and travelers hurried on. To them it was simply a place of dread, but to the valley folk it was more a reminder of what happens when blood refuses to break, when graves outnumber the living, when silence speaks louder than screams. And so the farm endured, shrouded in quiet, its secrets sealed behind wood and earth. The silence was not peace, it was warning, and those who lived nearby learned to heed it. Decades passed, and still the farm stood. The century turned. New railroads cut across Kentucky, towns grew into cities, but the valley remained quiet, its haunted corner untouched. Travelers who arrived in later years found the farmhouse decayed yet unyielding, its roof sagging but intact, its windows dark as sockets in a skull. Locals spoke less and less of the family, as if silence could erase them. Yet the farm remained, crouched at the edge of the woods, its fields marked by mounds that never vanished. By the early 1900s, few remembered the faces of the family who once worked those fields. Some said the last of them died in the house, their bodies hidden with the others beneath the soil. Others insisted descendants still lived within, shadows behind the curtains, waiting for the night to move again. What no one denied was the weight that lingered over the land, a heaviness that made the air colder, the birds quieter, and the earth feel restless underfoot. Surveyors who came to chart new boundaries found their instruments behaving strangely near the property, compasses spinning without reason. They reported patches of ground that sank softly, as though hollow beneath. One man refused to return after stumbling upon what he swore were human teeth scattered near a tree line. His report was ignored, but his silence afterward said enough. The number 73 still haunted the valley. Generations repeated it like scripture, though no one could prove its origin. Children who grew into adults recalled being told never to play near the orchard, never to count the mounds, never to speak of the family after dark. Even those who left the valley carried the story with them, spreading it to neighboring counties until the farm's reputation reached further than its fences ever had. The house itself became a monument to secrecy. Its shutters rotted, its porch sagged, but no one dared tear it down. A few opportunists tried, dreaming of timber or land to claim, but each abandoned their plan after a single visit. One returned pale, muttering that the walls still breathed. Another swore he heard footsteps upstairs, though the rooms were empty. None made the attempt again. In the 1920s, a group of young men dared each other to explore the orchard at night. They carried lanterns, laughing loudly to mask their fear, but when they returned, their laughter was gone. One refused to speak at all, while another babbled about faces in the dirt. The third left the valley within weeks, never explaining why. Their silence became part of the legend, just as every silence before had done. The farm endured not because it thrived, but because it resisted. Nature seemed unwilling to reclaim it fully. Trees grew thick around the edges, but the house remained clear, as though the land itself knew to keep it visible. Weeds sprouted in the fields, but the mounds stayed distinct, untouched by plow or root. Time passed, but the graves endured, their count unchanged, their silence heavier with each passing year. By mid-century, historians and folklorists began to hear of the story. They came searching for records, for names, for facts. But in the county archives, the family appeared only in fragments, births unmarked, deaths unrecorded, census lines that blurred into repetition. Scholars left frustrated, muttering that the truth was lost to the soil. Yet the valley folk knew better. The truth was not lost, it was buried. Some who visited the farm later claimed they felt watched, though the windows were dark. Others described a smell faint, metallic, unmistakable that rose from the earth itself. And a few swore they saw children, pale and identical, standing at the edge of the woods, watching them until they fled. No photographs were taken, no proof offered, but the stories persisted, as they always had. The farm remains to this day a scar upon the valley, its secrets unspoken, its graves unmarked. 73. The number endures, whispered from parent to child like a warning carried through generations. Travelers still avoid the southern road, preferring longer paths. Locals still glance away when the subject is raised. And the farmhouse still waits, its timbers dark, its silence heavy, its story unfinished. What lies beneath that soil may never be unearthed. Perhaps the graves belong only to the family's own dead, victims of bloodlines that folded too tightly. Perhaps they hold strangers, stolen to feed a legacy of secrecy. Or perhaps they hold something else entirely, something not meant for the living to uncover. The valley does not ask. The valley does not dig. It lives in the shadow of that farm, generation after generation, content to let the silence remain. For some doors, once opened, can never be shut again. And some graves, once disturbed, may not stay buried. The farmhouse at the edge of the woods still stands, The graves still lie beneath its fields, and the story of the forbidden family is not finished. It waits, patient as the soil, for those who dare remember.